All right.
Okay. All right, here goes. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are rejoined by historian Dr. Gerald Horne of the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies of the University of Houston. And he's the author of several books, including Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in the 17th Century North America and the Caribbeans, Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, Confronting the Black Jacobins, the U.S., the Haitian Revolution, and the Origins of the Dominican Republic, W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography, the Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii, and plenty more where that came from. And this is our special, this is our Make Me Want to Holler, all things the Black diaspora episodes from Turtle Island to Brits and Haiti and elsewhere, but it's also our special 4th of July special, and who better to critique and denounce the 4th of July than Dr. Gerald Horne. So first off, Dr. Horne, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's an honor to have you back. And actually, just before I get to my first question, Dr. Horne, again, it's a real honor to have you back. The last time you came on, you must have the Midas touch, a huge magic touch, because when you shared our episode, we got over. I think we have like 1,000 views, or a little more over 1,000 views. So you were a very popular. So you were a very popular guest. The episode was quite popular as it went pretty viral. So I have to thank you for that. And is there any chance that you can you can share all of the other content I've done of 200 something episodes of 1+1?
We'll take that under advisement.
All right. Well, anywho, it's a like I said, it was fantastic. I'm glad the episode was so widely seen, and I thank you very much for that. And I thank you for coming back on the program. And all right, so on to the discussion. Discussion at hand. So, Dr. Horne, it's the 4th of July, and I have no doubt you and the public at large are being subjected to an avalanche of enforced patriotism, obnoxious nationalism, and also a total or half whitewashing of history, and of course little to no discussion on should we even be celebrating, this holiday, given ongoing settler colonialism, neo-Jim Crow, and neo-Confederate hangovers and ongoing legacies, and of course ongoing legacy, and of course larger colonialism that the U.S. is conducting abroad. So my first question, Dr. Horne, is why should our people, Black Americans, Latinos, Latinas, or Latinx people across the diaspora, and Native Americans from the mainland, and Indigenous Hawaiians and Alaskans, why should they boycott this day or stage protest against the 4th of July?
Well, I think the reason is obvious, because the groups that you've enumerated are the victims of the establishment of the United States of America. Not only that, but in that litany that you just outlined, I would say that progressive people and people of goodwill of all sorts should also boycott this orgy of national chauvinism known as the 4th of July, because by celebrating the 4th of July, you're basically celebrating genocide against Native Americans. After all, it was only a few hundred years ago that they patrolled this land, that they worked this land. And in a place like Texas, it's very difficult to find any trace of their presence. They were generally wiped out, liquidated. And so by marking the 4th of July, you're celebrating genocide, And by celebrating genocide, you're opening the door to future genocides. And that doesn't even touch upon the question of mass enslavement, because we all know that with the triumph of the slave owners post 1776, July 4th, you had an exponential and geometric expansion of the number of enslaved Africans in North America. What's striking about the formation of the United States is that it quickly ousted Britain as the captain of the international slave trade. As early as the 1790s, this is just a few years after the proclamation of the United States, US nationals were controlling the slave trade to Cuba. By the 1840s, US nationals were controlling the slave trade to Brazil, the largest market of all. And so why anyone of goodwill would celebrate this outrage is beneath intelligence. I should also say that to punctuate the point that I just made, you know that a book that I published last year was called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of US Fascism. Now, what's interesting about Texas, right now the second most populous state after California, is that it endured a process not unlike the formation of the United States of America. What I mean is the United States seceded from the British Empire in no small measure because they thought the slave owners thought Britain was moving towards abolition, and plus they objected to Britain trying to circumscribe their ability to move west, continuing the land grab, seizing the land of the Native Americans, because it was causing London to expend tremendous amounts of blood and treasure. By 1836, you saw a similar process in Texas, or Tejas. What happens is that in the late 1820s, Mexico, under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, had moved to abolish enslavement of Africans. This was not accepted with equanimity in the Mexican province known as Tejas, or Texas. So like the United States in 1776, the slaveholders revolted and set up an independent country, the Republic of Texas. Soon, the flag of the Republic of Texas could be found off the coast of Angola, Southwest Africa, as they were snatching Africans and dragging them across the Atlantic. The Lone Star flag of the Republic of Texas could be found off the coast of Brazil, as they were dragging Africans to Brazil, and also off the coast of Cuba. Because if you look at your map, you'll see that Galveston, Texas is a hop, skip, and a jump away from Havana, Cuba. And so just like the United States began to oust Britain from its leadership of the international slave trade, Texas, by the 1830s, was trying to oust the United States from leadership of the international slave trade. But what it didn't realize was that times had changed. The major development was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, where the unpaid working class, speaking of the African population of Haiti, revolted and overthrew the slave-owning class. Probably some of the folks not far distant from you in Belgium were slave owners in Haiti, or in Saint-Domingue, as it was then called, since it was a French-speaking colony in the first instance. And so what's striking is that Haiti begins to campaign against the Republic of Texas, and Texas could not stand the pressure. And so it crawled into the United States of America so it could have backup as the 28th US state. And of course, it remains thus far part of the United States of America. I say all this to say that the formation of the United States of America on July 4th, 1776, was no great leap forward for humanity. It was a great leap backwards, particularly for the indigenous population and for the African population. And it was also part of a transnational trend. As I have written previously, in 1688, you had the so-called Glorious Revolution in the British Isles. What that basically meant was that the rising merchant class began to try to clip the wings of the monarch, turning the monarch into a figurehead, a rich figurehead at that, as King Charles III could well attest. And up to that point, the king, the monarch, had a stranglehold over the African slave trade. But as a result of having his wings clipped, he had to yield to the merchants, who then began to descend upon Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic to work for free, particularly to the Caribbean, particularly to Jamaica and Barbados. And so what do you see here? What am I outlining? 1688, you see these corruptible figures clip the wings of the monarch so they could grab a portion of the trade in enslaved Africans. 1776, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they revolt against British rule in no small measure so that they could grab a portion of the trade and commerce in enslaved Africans. 1836, Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, and these other freebooters and pirates who ostentatiously give their names to the major cities in Texas. Speaking of Houston, where I'm now sitting, and Austin, Texas, they revolt against Mexico in order to grab a portion of the African slave trade. And 1861, the US Civil War, where the slave owners feel that the Lincoln government is moving towards abolition. I think that that's an incorrect perception, but in any case, they try to overthrow the Lincoln government so that they could continue to enslave Africans and indeed expand the African slave trade. In fact, if you look at some of their records, they had plotted out the enslavement of Africans into the 20th century. It was like the 1,000-year Reich in neighboring Germany, in your neighbor Germany. They thought that they would be doing this for quite a long time. But alas, they miscalculated. They gambled and lost everything. At least they lost their major investment, speaking of investment in enslaved Africans, not least because 200,000 Black men in particular joined the Lincoln Army and turned the tide against the slave-owning class, overthrew them. But what happens is that their property in enslaved Africans, which was worth billions, and that's when billions were worth more than billions are worth today, those billions in property, it was taken without compensation. And if you want to make an exploiter unhappy and miserable and vengeful, take their property without compensation. And that's what happens in this country. The problem was, of course, is that the property was property in people, and the people were walking around in the same neighborhoods as the former enslavers. That was a volatile combination. It leads to terrorism against Black people. It leads to murder and lynching and rapine against Black people. And this is happening in a nation that supposedly represents a great leap forward for humanity, that supposedly is the grandest creation on God's green earth. And so this is just part of the reason why, instead of celebrating July 4th, 1776, we should be mourning. We should be crying a river of tears about what happened as a result of July 4th, 1776.
Brilliant answer. And actually, I have to ask this follow-up question. I think actually, when we talk about the history of Texas and how as you mentioned and how that state was founded, Yeah, I think in the future, I definitely want to have like a whole show on that. But I do have to ask this question, which is, what's the real story of the what's the real story of the Alamo? Because that always seems, in song and in popular culture, it's always remixed as this. I pity the poor white supremacist. So what's the real story about
Well,
behind
as I
the
said,
Alamo?
you had a revolt against Mexico because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery. Not only that, but the enslavers in Texas wanted to grab more of Mexican land, and they were challenged in that, by the way, by the United States itself, which, after helping Texas secede from Mexico, then wages war against Mexico, grabbing California, which is now the most populous state in the United States of America, 40 million plus people, and also, by some measures, the fifth largest economy on planet Earth. Interestingly enough, another former colony, not of Mexico, but of Spain, is Florida, which is now the third largest state in the United States. It's interesting. The three largest states of the United States, California and Texas, used to be part of Mexico. Florida, number three, used to be part of the Spanish Empire. And of course, I should mention, I
Wow.
wrote an entire book about Cuba where I talked about how the United States had designs on Cuba and wanted to seize Cuba and failed. And of course, fortunately, that happened, because if that had happened, we might have been deprived of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. In any case, this story of the Alamo is one of those fictitious tales about alleged bravery and courage, but actually, it's part and parcel of this war of aggression against Mexico. Interestingly enough, one of the few survivors of those who were defeated by Mexican forces at the Alamo, which is in San Antonio, Texas. Oh, by the way, Victor Wembanyama, who you may know from France, the next big thing in basketball, right now, he's in San Antonio, Texas. I hope he's sufficiently diplomatic not to make any non-diplomatic statements about the Alamo, because basically this was no profile in courage. They were fortunately defeated. They were fortunately liquidated. One of the few people who escaped to tell the tale, and one of the reasons we know about it, was one of the enslaved Africans who escaped. That's all in my book, and I won't say more, because if I say more, then people may not have an incentive to read the book.
and and everybody should get your wonderful books. And I still have I still have to get I still myself have to get several copies. So thank you for that. And I have to ask them this question, which is, what would an alternative holiday to the 4th of July be? And how would you go about it? And how do you approach this day when when it comes about, or like-minded comrades of yours? How do you go? How do you try to go about this? This day.
Well, if you go online, or if you go to the Activist News Network, you'll find a lecture, an interview that I gave just last night, explaining July 4th, the history, some of the class forces that I've just explained to your audience. And I would recommend that interview, which originally played on WBAI FM radio in New York and the Pacifica Radio Network generally. I would recommend that your audience check out that interview. But in any case, we have a competitor, if you like, to July 4th, and that's a Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth, which I write about in my Texas book, ostensibly marks the abolition of enslavement in Texas. It's a very convoluted story. That's not altogether accurate. But today, in 2023, it's come to symbolize a holiday marking the abolition of slavery generally in the United States. And that's a holiday, despite some of the lack of factual substantiation explaining the holiday, but still, that's a holiday worth celebrating. And when we're able to seize power, I think that we can negate and void January 4th and move the national holiday to June 19th.
Interesting. And then how do you try to go? And so when you go about this day, you more or less you don't celebrate the 4th of July, but you'll celebrate Juneteenth or whatever indigenous groups or Latinx groups are celebrating. I assume, right?
Oh, sure. And also May 5th. That's a day that marks the victory over France. Recall that during the U.S. Civil War, the French regime had seized Mexico and were actually trying to work out a deal with the enslavers in Texas to overthrow abolition and welcome enslavers from Texas into Mexico. May 5th marks a victory over the French occupation forces by patriotic Mexicans. May 5th is celebrated more in the United States by Mexican Americans than in Mexico. That too is a holiday worth marking and worth celebrating. And I should also punctuate Juneteenth by saying June 19th also marks the day when the French puppet leader, Maximilian, this is 2 years after 1865, June 19th, 1865, June 19th, 1867, the French puppet leader, Maximilian, is captured by patriotic Mexican forces and executed. That's another reason to celebrate June 19th.
Fascinating. And that's a perfect segue then to this question. Actually, before I ask this question, I have to ask this. Now Britain, the British Empire was, was a very brutal empire. The first, the model of settler colonialism originally started in Ireland, Scotland, well, in Ireland and so forth. And of course, it was done on steroids in the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. But of course, in your books and in your writings, you talk about how, sort of, to sort of sum up, the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence. I have to quote, George Carlin, who said that this country was founded by a group of slave owners who wanted to be free. So they killed a lot of white Englishmen to wipe out, the Red Indian men, to steal more land from the brown Mexican men, so that they could continue to slave their black African men, to make room so that they could drop a bomb on the yellow Japanese people. You want to know what the motto of our color should be? You give us a color, we'll wipe it out. So but basically, yeah, but in a nutshell, that's the Revolutionary War. That's the War of Independence, which is a bunch of slave owners who wanted to be free to continue brutal settler colonialism and expand the slaveocracy. So, but Britain had, but even when Britain did abolish slavery in the Caribbeans, they still had their colonies in the Caribbeans. They had their colonies in many parts of Africa. But wasn't that? Could you say that the British Empire, they restructured slavery? It was slavery by another name, and not the kind of How would you describe how Britain restructured its rule over the mostly non-white world?
Well, history often presents us with difficult choices. For example, the United States, as you know, has as a civic religion anti-communism, but yet it entered an alliance with the Soviet Union in 1941, 1942 totally changed the propaganda during those few years of World War II. Joseph Stalin, subsequently and previously derided as a tin-pot dictator, was seen as this great humanist. Go on YouTube and watch the movie Mission to Moscow, which was made in Hollywood at the behest of President Roosevelt in the White House because he wanted to help to change the image of the Moscow, the Soviet Union, the United States of America. So we recognize that history presents us with difficult choices. The so-called patriots led by George Washington, they would not have been able to prevail against the British Empire but for assistance from the Dutch. Recall that the Dutch monarchy just apologized for enslaving Africans. Now, people who go to Amsterdam today might be surprised to recognize that some of the most vicious enslavers during the bad old days of slavery were the Dutch enslavers, for example. The record clearly shows.
Did not know that, actually. Interesting.
Well, absolutely. I mean, after all, I mean, who helped to invent apartheid in South Africa, for example?
True.
And of course, the so-called patriots, the enslavers led by George Washington, would not have been able to prevail but for the assistance from the French monarchy. Indeed, France went into debt to subsidize the enslavers and stepped up exploitation of enslaved Africans in what is now Haiti. And that led both to the French Revolution of 1789 and the igniting of the Haitian Revolution in 1791. So history is full of these sorts of contradictions. It's difficult to say that wars have been won with the assistance of angels. I'm afraid to say that life thus far does not work like that. With regard to Britain in particular, with the defeat they suffered at the hands of the enslavers, what happens is a ricocheting effect. Number one, 1788, Britain is looking for a place to dump their poverty-stricken, and that leads to the settler colonialism in Australia, one of the most brutal and bitter genocides on the history of human life inflicted on the Indigenous of Australia. That's a direct outgrowth of the British defeat in North America. Keep in mind as well that after Britain had lost its market for enslaved Africans in North America, that provides impetus for Britain to move to curtail its role in the African slave trade by 1807 and curtail its role in slavery itself in Jamaica, Barbados, etc. by 1833, 1834. Now, did that mean that Shangri-La descended upon the Caribbean after London was forced to abolish slavery? No, I'm afraid not. However, it was a step forward. And what's interesting, since I debate these issues all the time, is that one of the things I've found is that those who try to defend the United States oftentimes try to attack the forces that oppose the United States from the left. I mean, for example, in my interview last night that you can find at the Activist News Network, I anticipate that by talking about Canada. Canada, as the social scientists would say, is a control group. It does not revolt against British rule. Today, or actually a few days ago, Toronto, the leading city in Canada, just elected a socialist mayor. Canada has the single-payer healthcare system for medical care that the United States can only dream of, where you have this pay or die system. And you would think that the country that had this alleged grand revolution, speaking of the United States, would have a more humane medical care system than this country that did not have a revolution. Now, when you mention that, of course, then you get attacks on Canada from the left. They start talking about Canada's policy towards the First Nations people, which has been horrendous, that is to say the Indigenous. But I think what you need to do, and this is what I would recommend to the US patriots, is that they stop trying to cover up for the United States of America. I mean, you're covering up for a nation that can inflict genocide on the Indigenous, the only nation to drop an atomic bomb on Japan in August 1945, one of the most outrageous and spectacular examples of mass murder. Tens of thousands of people die instantaneously in the history of humanity. So rather than defend this nation that committed genocide in Vietnam, tried to commit genocide in the Korean Peninsula, waged wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, tried to destabilize Syria, overthrew the regime in Libya, rather than trying to defend this bloodstained republic by attacking from the left any nation that has crossed swords with the United States, you should just be honest and say, okay, I'm going to criticize Canada, but I'm not going to defend the United States of America. I think that that would be the only honest approach, but don't hold your breath until that event takes place.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because one would argue, in fact, I think I would even argue that while Canada does have a single payer healthcare system, it does have its history of slavery of Black people, its settler colonialism towards its Indigenous people, which is still ongoing, and it's been a partner in crime to the British Empire. It was part of the British Empire, and to the Anglo-American Empire in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and you name the country. And
the point is, I was comparing Canada to the United States. I wasn't comparing. It's like candidates. A friend of mine is running for president right now in the United States, Cornel West. And when you run for president, your line basically is, don't compare me to the almighty. Compare me to the person I'm going to replace, which is Mr. Biden. And so likewise, when you're doing these comparisons, I'm not comparing Canada to Shangri-La. I'm comparing it to the United States in order to point up the debilities and the weaknesses of the leading imperialist power in order to cut down to size the leading imperial power, which I think would be a great leap forward for humanity if it's cut down to size. And so, to put it another way, we're talking about who has the cleanest dirty shirt. And
the cleanest dirty shirt.
Right, exactly. And so the United States, you cannot say that the United States has the cleanest dirty shirt. That's for sure. That's the dirtiest dirty shirt. And so, therefore, we should focus like a laser beam on seeking to cut down to size US imperialism, which would then open the door to going after its comrades. Trust me, if during my lifetime we're able to cut US imperialism down to size, I guarantee you that then we're going after Canadian imperialism.
Okay.
But
okay, all right, okay. I like that. Okay, I like that approach.
So, it's, as the people, I'm from, my roots are in Mississippi, the heart of darkness in the United States. And there's a saying in Black Mississippi that people don't have a pot to piss in.
Yes.
And yet they're going to be taking on all comers like a drunk in a bar. And so, as a person in the United States who is going toe-to-toe with US imperialism, I'm trying to organize or help to forge the broadest coalition possible to target US imperialism. And then, once again, after we're able to cut US imperialism down to size, Then, of course, we'll go after Canadian imperialism, we'll go after British imperialism, we'll go after Belgium imperialism, we'll go after French imperialism, we'll go after German imperialism, we'll go after Japanese imperialism. But right now,
as I like to say, pan Euro imperialism or Anglo-American imperialism, and I'm definitely of the historical opinion that the British Empire never ended. It just restructured itself, kind of like how you described what Britain did when it abolished slavery. It just restructured how it subjugated its subjects, and I guess you could also say the same thing about France and other great powers, right? Or evil powers, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of France, I'm doing a book on slavery in Washington, D.C. right now. So let me crowdsource a question. A few days ago, I was in the Boston Public Library, and I was reading correspondence from anti-slavery forces in the 19th century. And there was a letter from the 1830s that suggested that when there was a Republican victory in France, that in solidarity, their comrades in Washington marched hundreds of enslaved Africans through the streets. The letter doesn't explain why they did that. And so I'm trying to figure out what's the connection between a so-called Republican victory in France and marching black enslaved people through the streets. Are they trying to say that, are they just trying to make mockery of black people and their status? Or are they saying there's a connection between republicanism and enslavement? And interestingly enough, after the Republican victory in France, you did see the acceleration of the move to take over Algeria, for example, and install settler colonialism. But in any case, anybody who has anybody who even may know, not to mention have speculation, as to why you would have this marching black people through the streets of Washington in order to celebrate a Republican victory in France, look up my email address and write me a line. Do you have any speculation, by the way?
Actually, I wasn't planning on even asking this question, but I think I can sort of answer that by saying I think what that goes to show you is that the French Revolution, which is a series of social upheavals, in reality, it's not just one, one event. But I think what that goes to show you is that while those who were influenced by the Enlightenment and secularism and abolishing of monarchs and people who advocated liberalism, which is a slightly more progressive version of the ancien regime, the monarchs and the class system. I think what it goes to show you is that black people were definitely excluded. Those those who were subjects of the French Empire were excluded from that. Certainly women to a degree are also excluded from that. And just like when people lionize the 4th of July, the Revolutionary War, the War of independence, they'll talk about some of the very lofty ideals, and certainly if you read the Constitution, it seems good on paper. But who's excluded from this great leap forward is indigenous people, is black people, is slaves, it's women, and even during the Revolutionary War, as Howard Zinn has often talked about in his lifetime and his books, there was a real class antagonism that was going on between those who were trying to overthrow the British. And I think somebody like Zinn would argue that the Revolutionary war, was because Zinn, was against the idea that it's one of the good wars, just like the Civil Wars often argue that's a good war. Zinn was of the opinion that no, it was that while some people may have had good ideas, in the end of the day, it was just rival oligarchs who overthrew British colonialists, but continued on with settler colonialism, even a new, even the beginnings of an American empire, and of course the ongoing, was, brutal subjugation of indigenous Latinos and our people, Black people.
Well, let's talk about hypocrisy. Also, in the Activist News Network, I gave an interview about the events in France, and the headline was that President Macron, your neighbor, when you had the unrest in Iran, he was on his soapbox, for example, denouncing the Iranian regime. And then, of course, you have the unrest in France, in Lyon, Paris, Nanterre, Marseille. And of course, he unleashed the police, arrested thousands of people. This after a young man of North African descent was captured on tape being executed by the police. And obviously, this is rank hypocrisy. But sadly, rank hypocrisy is not unique to France. As you were talking, I was thinking of the hypocrisy of many of these folks in the United States of America. They spare no denunciation when it comes to denouncing socialist blunders, errors, or in fact crimes. When it comes to the United States, they try to sweep it under the rug. As I said, they attack from the left, they attack from the right. They try to portray the United States as this great leap forward for humanity. And yet, but for the socialist camp, you probably would not have had the liberation of Africa from colonialism, for example. So if they were to say, on the one hand, there were blunders and errors under socialism, but on the other hand, under socialism, Africa was liberated from European colonialism. That's the sort of approach that we don't have. Instead, they seek to defame the reputation of socialism and portray the United States as some sort of
meaning the USSR and China and its relations, which vastly much more progressive than the Western European states and America and Canada.
Yes, and also even some of our Marxist friends. Look at the United States of America, for example. Our Marxist friends, bless their hearts, they like to talk to us about the class question. And yet, probably the most profound class question of all has been slavery. You're talking about unpaid workers. You're talking about workers who are massacred, who are slaughtered, who are raped, etc., and oftentimes exhibit the kind of class struggle and intensity of class struggle that you would think that Marxists would celebrate. But at least in the United States, Marxists generally do not speak of slavery as a class question. Turn that coin over. If you look at settler colonialism, particularly in North America, it involved Europeans of various class backgrounds, sponsored by the 1%, dispatched to North America to unseat the indigenous, take their land, and then establish slavery. That's class collaboration. Just like they don't describe slavery as a class question and describe the enslaved as being an exemplar of class struggle, they do not describe the European settlers as involved in class collaboration. Although how do you explain 75 million people voting for Donald Trump in 2020, a criminal, a grifter, a con man, with that 75 million almost all being of European descent, of various class backgrounds? How can you explain that phenomenon without talking about class collaboration? If you look at
Dr. Horne, it's because we're drunk on identity politics, and the wokeism is just turning all of them off.
Well, no. I think it's a bit more complicated. I think that many of them, if you want to be subjective about it, I think that many of them are blinded not by wokeism or identity politics. They're blinded by racism. They're blinded by white supremacy. They're blinded by white privilege. That is to say, that one of the reasons they're always making excuses for the settlers and their voting proclivities, or not being able to analyze the settlers and their voting proclivities, is because they're too immersed in race privilege themselves. And then I think that they like to dismiss Black struggles, even though, as I said, it's the exemplar of class struggle, as identity politics. Yet whiteness and white supremacy, as I pointed out in my book on the 16th century, this whole white notion is probably the most brutal example of identity politics in world history, because fundamentally what you saw were people who were warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish. You just mentioned how settler colonialism was established in Ireland by the English. So what happens when they cross the Atlantic, these people who had been warring, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Russian versus Lithuanian, Croat versus Serb, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. Once they cross the Atlantic, they adopt a new identity of being white, and they all join hands in order to exploit the indigenous. Now, if that's not the politics of identity, I don't know what is. But yet, that's not described as the politics of identity. But victims of white supremacy who are told that they are inferior, that they come from an inferior continent, speaking of Africa, and when defensively they retaliate by talking about Black as beautiful or seeking to connect their history to the glories of ancient Egypt, that's identity politics. You see, I mean, there's other thing that's just life. That's just normal. And then they wonder why we're on the verge of fascism, even though if they were to look in the mirror, they might get a hint.
Brilliant response, and actually, that leads to this third official question of mine, which is why? Yeah, it's a bit of a repetitive question, but let me just ask it anyways. Which is, why do you think some white Marxist socialists can cheer on the toppling of statues to Confederate heroes, but there is either a reluctancy or open hostility when it comes to the attack on the founding fathers or honest Abraham Lincoln, all of whom had slavery, engaged in the brutal theft, genocide, and cruel subjugation of indigenous people and Mexican land and people. Your response?
Well, that's a good question. And I would say stay tuned, because the analysis that I've just given you, not only of July 4th, but of slavery as a class question, these are relatively new concepts. And it's going to take a while for them to sink in. I have no doubt that they will sink in, that it will be considered sooner rather than later as common sense. And so keep in mind that this toppling of Confederate statues, this is relatively new. This has not been the norm in the United States. Now that it is becoming the norm, stay tuned. I mean, I just wrote a book on Washington, D.C. And I was in Washington speaking, and people were talking to me about changing the name of the capital from Washington, precisely because he was a slave owner. It's called Washington District of Columbia. Already, the movement is afoot to change DC to Douglas Commonwealth. Douglas being Frederick Douglass, the great anti-slavery advocate, a great abolitionist, because, you know, Columbus, he's really been under fire. And this is nothing new, because he, of course, was a thief and a genocidaire, and statues to him have been toppled, in fact. And so stay tuned. This is an ongoing struggle. It's a lengthy struggle. And it's just like I was explaining about Britain and the British Empire. We were able to force the British in 1807 to curtail the role in the African slave trade. And a few decades later, we got them to abolish slavery itself. Just recently, you see Jamaica, Barbados in particular, moving to oust the monarch as head of state. The movement for reparations is relatively new, reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans, forcing Britain to pay. So this is a process. So stay tuned. Stay tuned.
So the toppling of Confederate statues and shunning the Confederate flag, is that chapter one, and is that chapter one of decolonization in America, and chapter two will be a debate on the American flag, or certainly the toppling of statues of Abe Lincoln, Mount Rushmore, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, and all the others?
2 points. One, in San Francisco, there's already been a debate about removing the name of Lincoln from a public school because of his weaknesses and transgressions. Point two, and neither you nor I may be around to see this, but ultimately, I think that we will have what I call Lancaster House talks in London. Recall that when settler colonialism in what was called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was under siege, the parties came to London, the original power, to negotiate for the settlers to relinquish power. I dare say.
Actually, Dr. Horne, Dr. Horne, can you repeat that again? Because there was a cut.
I said that in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, when the settlers were under siege by the Africans, they all came to London, which is the original colonial power, to negotiate the settlers relinquishing power and developing new elections, new constitution, etc. At some point, we will have Lancaster House talks in North America, where we return to London, the original power, the settlers on one side of the table, and their opponents, including people like myself, on the other side of the table, and we will negotiate a new dispensation that inevitably will involve reparations to the enslaved, land cessions to the indigenous, etc. Now, that may not happen during my lifetime or your lifetime, but I guarantee you that it will happen.
Well, let's hope that climate change doesn't come sooner, doesn't come anytime soon, and let's hope that an accidental nuclear war doesn't happen before that's justice, that road to justice happens. Mm-hmm. But then I have to ask this.
But we're getting close to the end.
All right, I just have a few questions left, but I have to ask this question. This is my fault for asking follow-up questions. I should know that rule by now. But all right, but I have to ask this one, which is, what do you think it's going to take for the U.S. left and broad people power movements to protest more the 4th of July, Columbus Day, and Thanksgiving Day? And I'm going to throw in this one as well, which is what do you think it's going to take for the plight of Indigenous Americans in the mainland, as well as Indigenous Hawaiians and Alaskans, to get the kind of urgent solidarity and frequent attention the way Black Lives Matter, Latinx Lives Matter, queer liberation, feminism, the right of illegal and legal immigrants, and the broad green and workers' rights movement? What will it take for all those movements? The environmental justice, the anti-imperialist movement, the Palestine justice movement, to show more urgent solidarity to the indigenous Americans?
Well, it's a process. So with regard to Columbus Day, as you know, it's been abolished in a number of U.S. jurisdictions. In a number of U.S. cities, it's called Indigenous Peoples Day, for example. Thanksgiving, likewise, has been under fire. It's a process. And, you know, the movement in this country is not as vibrant or as strong as it could be, not least because of the seduction of white supremacy, which is prevalent, all too prevalent amongst the settlers in particular, the European settler descendants in particular. But it's a process. It's coming. As I said, just like Lancaster House talks to settle the colonial question in North America, that it will happen in London sooner rather than later. That litany that you just outlined will also happen sooner rather than later.
All right, I sure hope so. And okay, all right. So, I sure hope so. I sure hope so. And two very quick final questions then. If you could replace Mount Rushmore, which Black, Latinx, or Indigenous American, past or present, would you have built? And any white leftists, past or present, you'd like to see replace Mount Rushmore, or at least the financial, or at least the financial currencies, yeah, or at least the financial, or at least the money that people carry in their wallets.
Well, John Brown, of course, who led an attempt to overthrow slavery in 1859 and was executed in what is now West Virginia. The other choices would be obvious. Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, socialist leaders like Eugene Debs. I mean, it's rather obvious, but we'll take that up once we seize power.
All right, and final question is, why should our and then final question is, why should our white socialist and Marxist friends, or frenemies, as we do have a love-hate relationship with them, why should our white socialist Marxist friends or frenemies study the Haitian Revolution, and not even just them, but also all Black people from Turtle Island to Britain to all of the Americas, Africa, and other small island nations?
Well, if you say that you're in favor of workers' rights, and you say you're in favor of empowerment of workers, one of the most stirring and sterling examples of the foregoing is the Haitian Revolution. The unpaid workers rise up, toss out the bosses, and seize power. It sets the stage for the growth of unions in North America. It sets the stage for the growth of socialist movements in North America and in fact worldwide. So the reason is obvious. And just as a point of personal privilege, you may want to start by looking at my book on the Haitian Revolution, where I make some of the same points that I've just articulated here.
All righty. Well, here's hoping. Here's hoping that America gets. Here's hoping that America gets to the level that New Zealand, Australia, and Canada is at, where people do protest Canada Day, Australia Day, and New Zealand, New Zealand Day. And here's hoping that we do get to that level where we're not just toppling down Confederate statues, but more of the founding fathers and even honest Abe. The late Glenn Ford once described the founding fathers as those miserable SOBs. I know you're not a cursing man, so I'm not going to say the V word. But anywho, all righty, Dr. Horne. The next time we have you back on the program, we have to talk more about Texas, Haitian Revolution, and how certain colonialists did compensate people who did lose their money to slavery. But we're going to save that for another time. Well, we were joined on this edition of yes, we were joined on this special edition of 1+1, our 4th of July special, our protest the 4th day with Dr. Gerald Horne of History and African American Studies at the University of Texas, the author of over a dozen.
University of Houston.
Yes, University of Houston, yes. Yes, University of Houston. The author of over a dozen books, such as Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, Confronting Black Jacobins, the U.S., the Haitian Revolution, and the Origins of the Dominican Republic. W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography, and the Counter-Revolution, the Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, and Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii. Dr. Horne, I thank you so much for coming on the program. I hope we can organize another interview session. But until then, don't enjoy the 4th of July. But we'll just say, power to the people, death to white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism. Right?
Right on. All right. Good luck to you.
Ciao till then.